Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of Alta Asks Live. My name is Beth Spotswood, and I am Alta's digital editor. Today, I am very excited to talk with journalist Phil Bronstein and one of his most recent subjects, private investigator and author, Josiah Tink Thompson. If you haven't had a chance to read Phil's article in our current issue, it's all Noir themed, called Last Call for Gumshoes. It's about a dying breed of old school private eyes, mostly in San Francisco. You can do so by clicking the link directly underneath us. And it's a really fun article. I encourage you to check it out. If you're watching now, while you're watching, you can become a member of Alta, get this gorgeous magazine, along with all sorts of exciting perks we've got going right now. Go to altaonline.com and click join to check that out. We've also recently launched a California book club led by the incredible John Freeman. We'll have links to both of those here in the chat section. Oh my God, sorry, a cat is here. If you have questions for Phil or for Tink, please either use the question button or the chat. We're going to talk for about 25 minutes, and at the end, I will grab as many of those questions and get them answered as I can. So with that, let's begin. Tink and Phil, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. You didn't tell me it would be live, though.
Oh, my apologies. It's live.
Okay, now I know.
And this will, oh boy, and it might be wacky today, folks. And this is all going to be up on Alta Online later today. So if you miss any part of this, or it's so compelling that you'd like to rewatch it, you can do so at altaonline.com. Phil, I'm going to start with you. I remember way back to well over a year ago when you were telling those of us at Alta about this story idea, that there was this really interesting group of old school San Francisco private eyes. What first attracted you to this subject?
I can't remember. No, I think it was, I remember that drink we were all having, the Alta folks. That wasn't the first time I'd raised it. I'd raised it with your editor and publisher, Will Hurst, a few times, and with Blaze, your editor-in-chief, your managing editor. And basically, you know, you're looking at all these San Francisco institutions, and Tosca's comes to mind, which was a sort of center of a lot of San Francisco noirish North Beach activity. And now I don't know what it is anymore, but it's kind of lost its luster. And a lot of people think San Francisco has lost its luster. And one of the things that people talk about is the kind of noirish feeling about the place, the bohemianness of it. And that resides, a lot of that, in this generation, I think, is a huge part of it, of these private eyes who very peculiarly, in a way, were scholars and authors and philosophy graduate professors from Haverford. And they were lefties. You know, they were protesting the war in Vietnam at the time when the sort of generation started in the business. And they were intellectuals, and they were not kind of the old, tired ex-cop, who you often sort of think of when you think of private eyes. And then I'd had some experiences, not with Tink, but with his great pal, David Fechheimer. Fechheimer came once to take my deposition, or to give me a summons to go get a deposition in a case. And then I'd been to his apartment, his house, his office. And I knew Jack Palladino and Sandra Sutherland, who were part of this early group of graduates from Hal Lipsett, the great detective. And I'd had dealings with them 30, 40 years ago. So I started to hear about people retiring. Tink, I think, you're retired, aren't you, Tink? Yeah. So and then, you know, David Fechheimer tragically died last year, and it was clear that, you know, we were losing. He was kind of in the center of this group, and we were losing this generation to retirement, to death, to.
Phil, did we lose you? Hi. All right, so Tink, I'm going to dive into you. Tink, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think Phil's frozen, but he'll come back to us.
Okay, let me comment on what Phil was talking, because
yeah,
it seems to me that nowhere in the article is there a very important point. It's how this all got started. And it was started by David. And David recognized an obvious fact, which was that people in journalism, reporters, were very much like investigators. They had to write because they had to write their piece when they got done, and they had to deal with people. They had to know how to do an interview and how to get to do an interview with somebody. So it was really Fechheimer starting out by recognizing the simplest thing in the world is to hire journalists to work as gophers, like I started out at $5 an hour, and they either make it or they don't, and that's how we all got hired.
Did you plan? I mean, you were, as it's mentioned in the article, you were a professor of philosophy. How did you? Can you just give us a little kind of detail of how you landed into being? I mean, you traveled the world, kind of having these insanely exciting adventures as a private investigator. How does one go from a college professor to rescuing a kidnapped kid in India?
Well, not carefully, certainly. No, I got an introduction to Hal Lipset, and Hal Lipset and I and the introducer and I all met for dinner at Grisson's. And I hit him for a job. It was completely impulsive. I hit him for a job, and he said at the end of the evening, "Well, Tink, I can't make a decision now. You'll have to be interviewed by my junior partner, who was Fechheimer." I'm sure he went back and told Fechheimer about this lefty college professor who wanted a job, right? And what fun can we have with him? So they hired me to do surveillance. That is, lefty college professor now is doing surveillance on union members in a violent strike in Oakland. They must have busted their gut laughing over that. And that's how it started.
And so how long were you a private investigator? What year did you start? And you've recently retired. Oh, and Phil's back.
November 1976. And my last case was in 2009. What's that? I don't know. Somebody do the math.
All right, great. What is the tie-in between this kind of beat literary intellectual description that Phil was talking about earlier, this North Beat connection, to the old school private investigators that doesn't exist in present day PIs?
Well, I don't know that it doesn't. I mean, I've lost touch really with the present generation of PIs. Eric Mason, of course, worked for me for a while, and I knew him, but I didn't know the other folks that Phil mentioned, actually.
Well, wait a second. You know Sandra Sutherland.
Yeah.
You know Jack Palladino.
Yeah, 3 of us were partners at one point.
Right. You know Eric Mason.
Yeah.
You know Alice Klein.
No.
You know Zach Fechheimer.
Yeah.
You know Kirsten.
Yeah.
You know Hal Lipset, or knew him.
Dead.
Those are a lot of people that were in this story who you know.
Oh, yeah. But I'm just saying, in terms of the present generation of people who are practicing, Zach Fechheimer, David's son, of course, is, but and Eric Mason is, I guess.
Yeah, Joe Parisi I had in there. You may not know him, but he's in the younger school. And then your son is a private eye.
Right. So can you talk a little bit? I mean, I know that you haven't had you haven't worked with kind of the younger generation of PIs, but what differentiates your how is their job different? Do they utilize different technology? Does it take a certain kind of personality to?
Okay, well, let me talk about how this generation came to be. Fechheimer decided that journalists would be great investigators. And so he hired a bunch of people who were not like your usual private investigator. The usual private investigator is at the top. Probably 80% of private investigators in California have some law enforcement background. Journalists didn't. We came from the other side. We never carried a gun, we never carried a badge, et cetera, et cetera. And that made an enormous difference in outlook and in how we got together and in how we treated potential witnesses. Private investigator has no authority. It's a huge difference whether you've got authority, like a law enforcement officer, and when you don't. We didn't. So, as Fechheimer understood real well, you had to do it on wit and understanding who it was you're dealing with and trying to permit to really get their say.
We're having a little bit of sound issue on your end, Tink. So if Amy in the background could go turn that down a little. Phil, I'm going to ask you a question.
Tink said?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I agree with everything he said, except that he doesn't know people who are in the story. But, you know, journalists and PIs are different also. They're very similar in many ways. It's basically, can you get people to talk to you? Do you know where the documents are? But PIs often work for lawyers, and lawyers have subpoena power. And they have the ability to have much more information than your average journalist. So the only point I disagree with Tink on is that connection, you know, that ability to get information is much greater if you're working for an attorney involved in a case than it is if you're a journalist.
Forgive my ignorance, Phil, but do journalists ever employ PIs on investigative reporting cases?
Well, Tink can answer in his personal experience, but in my experience, there is a relationship between journalists and PIs. I can't think of, I hired Fechheimer to do something, but that was on a personal level. I would never hire a PI. It's all, you meet in dark alleys. I wanted to show you the cover of Tink's book because I thought it was great. You see that?
Do you really meet people in dark alleys, Tink?
Yeah, and also well alleys.
So Tink, can you tell me a little bit about when we were talking before, you talked a little bit about the ethics of being a private investigator. In the world of journalism, in the world of law enforcement, there are very specific rules that one has to follow. In terms of being a private investigator, where do you draw the line between what you will and won't do for a client?
Depends on who you are, because the lines that are drawn are very personal and idiosyncratic. For example, in the eulogy to Fechheimer that Phil used, I recalled an event where I was present while David made the first interview with a woman who wanted her daughter found because she had disappeared. And after Fechheimer was pretty sure that there was no foul play involved and that she just decided to disappear, he told the potential client, he said, well, look, I'll take the case, but my rules. And my rules are that I won't tell you where she is if I find her. I'll pass messages back and forth, but I won't tell you where she is. The woman said, what? Why? And David said, because I might want to disappear sometime. So that was his role there. I did several child snatches, which are probably very seldom done in the business anymore. But back 30, 40 years ago, they were. And my rules always were that, okay, I'll take the case, but these are really games between adults, and it stinks, really. It's a stinking game. So look, I won't take the case unless you will go with me, and the child will be taken from the other parent's hands, as it were, and put in your hands within 2 minutes. Are you willing to do that? If they weren't, I wouldn't take the case. So those are personal rules. And
you've done a lot of work for defense, criminal defense.
Yeah.
Do you have any what's it like trying to find information on behalf of someone accused of a horrible crime?
Oh, murderers, rapists, etc., etc. Well, they're the client, and you pledge yourself to the interest of the client when you start working for it, and that involves all sorts of strange things. It involves certain dangers, as Hammett pointed out in the Maltese Falcon. When you take the case, you buy the client's picture of what's going on. You buy the movie that the client tells you that the client is in. And of course, in the Maltese Falcon, Spade buys that movie, and within a few hours, his partner's dead. So your client, who you pledge loyalty to, is also puts you in the most jeopardy, because there's no way when you start working for a client, if you know whether the movie you're told about is really the movie that the client is in. And that applies to criminal defense too.
Oh wait, Phil, I'm sorry. Phil, I muted you. Our sound issues go away when I mute you. Can you turn your speakers down? Did you want to chime in, Phil?
Is that better?
Yeah.
Sandra Sutherland in the story talks about representing Huey Newton, or being an investigator in the Huey Newton case. And that was a sort of moral quandary for her, and I think would have been for anyone. But she basically states the same thing that Tink says, which is, it's your client. You're just trying to find the facts. And what she found in a Huey Newton trial, despite Newton's personality and crimes, was that a witness against him was not viable. So, does she feel that? Well, read the story. You can see how she feels about it.
Again, the story you can click right below us, Last Call for Gumshoes. Tink, we have a question here from Will Hurst, our publisher. What are the high value cases for a private investigator? Which have the biggest paycheck? Divorce, stolen property, missing art, violent crime? What's your bread and butter?
Well, the first question is, what are the high value cases? And they're always civil cases. And they're also the dullest cases you take. My son hates civil cases. He practices in Marin County and does criminal defense there. Yeah, the bloody cases are always the criminal cases. They always take you further into the human situation than civil cases, which almost always have to do with, with the price of butter, with money, somehow or other. And they're kind of dull and boring.
Are the bloody cases, tough? Have you ever kind of gotten emotionally connected in a way that had a big impact on you?
Yeah, both my son and I did a death penalty case in Alabama. We had the case for 20 years. There were 2 white defendants. They were the subject of incredible prosecutorial misconduct. And they both died in prison before we could get them out.
And that impacted you. Do police officers work with private investigators, or do they hate them like in the movies?
Look, I've had really good relations with a bunch of cops, and I've had a few bad relations with cops. Depends on the person. Look, the cop has to see beyond the game that's getting played, and if you play by the rules, that's all you have to do to be a good player in football or in private detectively. And I think that's what defines whether you can have a good relationship or not.
Where do you learn the rules? I imagine that there are many that are unspoken and that you kind of figure out as you begin your work. When you get your PI license, I imagine there's a lot of nuance that they don't teach you.
Well, yeah. Well, well, you get it by experience. I mean, the strange thing about the world of the private eye is that it's a feudal system. You enter it, you can go to these schools, they don't teach you anything about being a private eye. You apprentice yourself to a master. And that's what I did with Fechheimer, Phil. I was lucky to have a real master there, and that's what you do. And the master, in many ways, kind of looks over your shoulder and doesn't put you in situations where he knows you'll screw up. That doesn't mean you don't screw up, because you can still manage that in all sorts of situations. But it's a feudal system. You apprentice yourself to a master, and you go through a period of apprenticeship, and then you're out the other end, and you do a better job of things. I started out on surveillance, and I lost the dude every time he turned around. It was just ridiculous, right? And slowly, you learn.
Phil, did you find, kind of as you developed this story, that San Francisco in particular has this old school group of private investigators because of the kind of beat intellectual North Beach vibe? Or is there was there, or currently is there, this kind of community in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, big cities around the country?
No, I don't think it ever existed anyplace else but here. And I don't know. I'd like to ask Phil, when do you think it ended? Has it ended?
We lost Phil.
I guess we lost Phil.
We lost Phil. Your next case is going to be what's wrong with Phil's Wi-Fi. Alta will employ you for that one.
Right.
But you feel that, I mean, in your experience, Tink, you've traveled all over the place. It's special to San Francisco.
Yeah, it's special, and look, it was there before I got there. It really started at the Lipset service around Fechheimer, and it started in the late 60s, early 70s before I got there. Phil, when do you think it ended?
I don't think it's ended, Tink. I think there are still, you have your son, you have David Fechheimer's son, you have this guy Webster, whose son became a private eye for a while, who was part of that group of Lipset folks. So I think people are trying to carry it on, but the problem is that precisely what you said about the need to get information from people. If you go and knock on people's doors these days, well, you don't. If someone calls you and you don't recognize the number, you don't pick it up.
Right.
Or you don't have a landline, or,
Right.
There are all sorts of challenges that I think didn't exist before. And people like Joe Parisi, who I think is quite a talented PI, sort of mourns the decades where it was much more collegial in a way. I mean, there was a community. I think Kirsten, who worked for David Fechheimer and now works for Zach, said that the Tosca's event that we talk about in the story, which was a memorial for David, she said, you will not see these same people together again for the rest of their lives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tink, I have to ask, because it is of great interest to me personally, and I'm sure lots of people, can you tell me a little bit about working on the Timothy McVeigh Oklahoma bomber case?
Sure. Fechheimer got the case, and then he suggested me to the chief counsel, and I got hired, but Fechheimer was there first. Yeah, we did I was there from December 1996 through trial. David was there from October 96 through trial. Fechheimer came up with what was a wonderful find. He found in an obscure newspaper in Kansas a photograph of this Ryder truck that had been rented by the FBI, right, and had contained their scuba search unit. Because once they got onto Geary Lake, which was where the bomb truck was supposed to be loaded, they had to look in the lake to see if any evidence was in the lake. So they brought in this Ryder truck and they parked it there, and they kept the press half a mile away. This was shot through a 500 millimeter lens. 4 days after they brought in their search team to search the lake, they brought their crime scene search unit in, who then very carefully measured the tire tracks and the distances and all of that of actually their own truck. So David handed it over to me, and I nailed it down. I got the photographer, we got affidavits from everybody, the lab, the original negatives, everything was set. This was going to be a trap. When the prosecutor opened anything about Geary Lake, we would be able to show that they measured their own tire tracks. It was wonderful. However, the prosecution surprised us. They waived on Geary Lake. They cut down their prosecution and didn't say a word about Geary Lake. That's the way it goes.
And Timothy McVeigh was executed by the federal government. His last meal, FYI, was mint chip ice cream. We have a question here. This is a great question from Will, actually. What's your favorite personal movie about a detective, Tink?
Oh, I love The Conversation, because I knew the guy who that was about, the sound guy, right?
Yeah.
The Gene Hackman role in the case was really Ralph Burchie. And Ralph Burchie worked for Lipset in various cases, and I did. One day, Ralph Burchie and I were sent by Fechheimer out to do to do a dope dealer's house in Marin and make sure there weren't any bugs that were planted there. So we did it, and we were driving back. And I said to Ralph, hey, Ralph, how do you make up cover stories if you get discovered right in the middle of something? Because that was not a problem for us. The house was basically empty and owned by our client. Well, so Ralph told me this wonderfully funny story. He said, well, I got hired by the Lefties, and I was up on Broadway. And this woman thought that her husband was bringing women home, right? So I had scattered mics around in the apartment, and I was down in the basement, and I had my earphones on, and I was adjusting the gain on the various mics that I'd placed around. And I heard these heavy steps up above me, right at the top of the stairs, and then the door was pulled open. It was the husband. He'd come home at lunch or something. I don't know why he was there, but he looks down at me with my earphones on, and he said, what the hell are you doing here, right? And Ralph said, and I couldn't have thought this before, but right in that moment, I thought of it. I looked up to him, and I said to him, I'm listening for termites. The husband said, oh, okay. Shut the door, and that was it.
That's pretty great. We're running out of time.
That came from the real Gene Hackman.
You mean the guy, the Gene Hackman character in The Conversation, which people are both texting me and putting here in the comments, seems to be the correct answer to the best movie about a private investigator. Yeah. We're running out of time, so I'm going to end with, I want to end with two questions, actually. The first is, someone asked here in the questions, either Tink or Phil, with all of the developments in technology, in AI, Phil's left again. Where do you see private investigation? What will it look like in the next 20 years? Is it going to be dramatically different? I mean, to Phil's point, I don't answer the phone for a number I don't know. I would never answer my door to a guy out there. Is it going to be completely different 20 years from now?
No. Look, PIs are the infantry. There always has to be infantry in warfare, and there will always, you got to go talk to people, right? And you got to get people without authority. I mean, usually you don't have a subpoena is beside the point. In most cases, when you knock on somebody's door and they come in, and they've got no necessity of talking to you. Mm-hmm. The real art is, and Fechheimer was the best on that any of us had ever known. You got to get somebody to talk to you. And that's what a journalist knows too. And that's where a lot of information comes, just from getting people to talk to you And that's the infantry's job, get people to talk to you.
Last question. If either one of you, we'll start with you, Phil, while your internet is still working, and then Tink. If you needed to hire, since as Tink is retired, if you needed to hire a private investigator for a serious case today, who would you go to?
You know, that's a hard question for me because I love them all evenly. I probably would go to Eric Mason or Joe Parisi.
It's a good choice.
Tink?
I'm going to say my son. But
You got to.
right.
You have no choice. All right, with that, we've gone 2 minutes over. Again, everyone, thank you for, I will take responsibility for the technical difficulties. Our apologies. We will work on fixing that for next time, where we will be joined on Wednesday, October 14th with Alta contributor Denise Hamilton and true crime podcast host Esther Ludlow. We're going to talk true crime podcast and the explosion of that genre in the podcasting world. This interview will be up on altaonline.com later today. Again, read Last Call for Gumshoes. It's a great article featuring Tink, written by Phil. Tink and Phil, thank you so much for navigating the internet, the information superhighway, and joining us today. Very grateful. And it's a big thank you to everyone who tuned in and put up with our wacky sound issues. Thanks again. Stay safe.
Well done.